Good evening, parents and juniors that are listening to this. This is Mr. Garofalo, Director of Guidance at Braintree High School. Most years around this time, we would hold an evening program for parents and for students, but mostly for parents because they can't take part in some of the things we do during the school day, to review kind of the college admissions process as a whole, what to expect, what to do, when to do it, things like that. So juniors, some of this information you've received already, perhaps in the Naviance workshop you do with the counselors or within individual meetings, but there are some things we haven't quite covered yet. So this presentation is for both juniors and parents, and here we go. So college admissions, what are the topics we're going to be covering? How do I begin the college search process? How do I decide which colleges I'm interested in? And along those lines, really most importantly, how to develop a college list, which many of you have already heard about. What does the application process look like? Some timeline information so you can put your head around what needs to be done when throughout the process, and a lot of factors and details that you need to know. So just to give you, and again, parents, because you might not be aware of this, some of the things we've already done. We've presented you an SAT and ACT overview, and I did that through Parent Square. Just so you know, obviously this year where we can't meet in person, and even for students where it's a little harder, we are going to be sharing some snippets here and there, whether it be through Parent Square, or you can see I have something listed called the guidance site, which I'll mention in a second. In addition, I've already mentioned juniors, you've attended hopefully a Naviance workshop with your guidance counselor. If you are unable to make that, they can cover some of the information when you have your individual meetings. We've created a guidance Google site so that we can start posting information. It was very valuable for our seniors this year as they went through the process. Not only so when we have things like this, but even when we do, for instance, like the Naviance workshop. If you go on the guidance site now, juniors, I'm sorry, I keep calling you seniors. If you go on the guidance site now, we posted a follow-up video regarding how to do a college search and research colleges. That's what we covered in that workshop. But, sometimes you might need a little refresher, and for parents, it's always good to have. So that's why we put together this guidance site, so we can keep supporting the things we're doing and put out more information to you. Right now, many of you are having your programming meetings with your guidance counselors to talk about classes for next year, but it's not just about classes for next year. As you can tell, for those who have met, we're incorporating a lot regarding your future plans into that meeting. I wanted to mention something called college rep visits. I think I mentioned it in a previous memo, but pretty soon I'll put something else out. Rep visits are virtual college visits that representatives, because they can't come to us in a traditional college fair visit format, set up virtual visits. It's through Naviance. The list will be on Naviance. I will send out information on this soon. But as of around April 1st, we will have different colleges who are able to sign up, and you would need to sign up so you can get the appropriate Zoom or Google Meet link to join that session. So keep an eye out for that, juniors. Your individual college meetings. Again, we're already kind of doing that with your individual programming meetings, but throughout the spring is always the opportunity to meet with your guidance counselors, because a lot of the things we cover are more in a general information format, but specifically each of you has your own individual path and questions and things that need to be answered, and that's what we can do in those individual meetings. In the fall, and this is of course tentative, but hopefully if we get back to normalcy, maybe we will be meeting in person for some of these workshops instead. Hopefully we can't hold a college fair. And typically we have a financial aid night, parents, in case you're wondering that, in October, which is plenty of time for you. But I will cover a few details about financial aid in a little bit. So just to give you a timeline, and if you notice on this timeline, I broke it up into kind of 4 chunks. Spring and summer of junior year. Well, that's kind of where we are now. Fall of senior year, winter senior year, spring of senior year, to break up where we are with things. Now, this is a timeline. This is a framework. Not everybody is going to follow this exactly as it's written here. And many of the things that maybe you might do during that second phase, some people are still working on right now, or vice versa. This is, again, a framework just to give you an idea on when things can and should be done. The main focus of spring of junior year, again, where you are now, is developing that college list. And I'm going to on the next slide or two tell you how you can do that. But that's exactly what we covered in the Naviance workshop, juniors. How to take your interest, what you're looking for, what profile, and develop a tentative college list. When we say tentative, that's because right now you're not committing to anything. There's no pressure to have to say where you're applying, never mind where you're going. It's about developing options. The other thing you're doing is hopefully attending college fairs. Of course, as you know, those are probably all virtual right now. I sent out some information about virtual college fairs and visiting campuses. Now, visiting campuses, I'll get into that in a second, but those are happening to some extent in person, but also virtually. You're researching schools. That's the big thing. Maybe later this spring, we'll send out information before you leave in June about identifying one teacher to write you a letter of recommendation. Most of you will only need one teacher along with your guidance counselor. You might start brainstorming your essay topics later this spring. And in fact, many English teachers in your classes, as we get to May and June, that might be an assignment that you're actually all working on. And we've sent out plenty of information about the SAT, ACT. You're taking them in the spring of junior year. So that's the main focus of these next couple of months. And over the summer, the research and the visits and the developing your list is the most important part of all of this. Fall of senior year, maybe you're finalizing that college list. You're defining it a little more. You're narrowing it down to ones that you're actually going to apply to. You start working on the college applications. Now, when I say working on, in the previous segment, you notice we talked about essays. Well, the essay is probably the thing, or the essays are the things that take the longest when it comes to the applications. So where we say you're going to be working on them later this spring and early in the summer and into the summer, well, in the fall, maybe you're finalizing that essay. By the end of the summer, you should all have at least a draft of one essay, if not more. Later in the fall, you begin submitting your applications. I would say most applications go out between mid-October and through the winter holiday. And then plenty of applications we're still submitting ones in January when we get back. But just to give you a timeline for four-year colleges, it's mid-October through December and into early and mid-January, depending on when your deadlines are. Completing your resume, maybe I actually should have chunked that up earlier. I think in the summer, completing your resume would be a great thing to do. You might want to retake the SAT or the ACT. You're securing those letters of recommendation from your guidance counselor or your one teacher, providing the information that they ask you to. When we get to the winter senior year, that's when you're really got to make sure you're hitting all your deadlines, and maybe you've submitted some of your applications in the fall, but you have a few more to do. Or maybe for some of you, if you're applying later in the cycle, you're doing all of them. So submitting those applications, you never want to miss a deadline. You also need to turn your attention to financial aid. As I said, we'll talk a little more about that later. Sending in your mid-year grades. When we say mid-year grades, it really means your term 2 grades. That's not anything you have to do. By that point, you've probably already done the steps we've asked you to do, and we actually send in the grades. And you begin searching for scholarships. So, as you applied to college, well, now you want to start applying for some scholarships, and we'll tell you how to do that as well. And in the spring of senior year, as you get to maybe where our seniors are currently now in March, you're receiving or have received your admission decisions and hopefully financial aid offers if you did all your homework correctly and everything you had to do from each of the colleges, so you can start narrowing down now to that, couple of schools that you're really going to consider making your final destination. Of course, you're only picking one. You keep searching and applying for outside scholarships. And just to bring the kind of timeline to a conclusion, if you're heading to a 4-year college, you must what we call deposit or choose that college by May 1st. So guys, if you think about it this way, our seniors still haven't had to decide, right? Because they have until May 1st of this year. That means they haven't decided. That means you have a good 14 months before this timeline kind of comes to an end. Just a couple of things on some trends in college admissions before we talk about how to develop your list. Students definitely are applying to a greater number of schools, and that was true even before this year. But if you have some friends who are seniors, you might have found that kids applied to an extra few schools this year because there was so much uncertainty. We're really hoping that for the class of 2022, things will return to a little more normalcy and you won't have to do that. But we'll talk about that, when you have your individual meetings. One trend that's been going on for at least 10 years, and so maybe it's not really a trend anymore, but something to be aware of, especially for parents, public institutions, the UMass system, Bridgewater State, Framingham State, these schools have definitely risen in competitiveness, in difficulty in getting in. And that's a good thing. It means that their reputation is getting better and better, and they have more competitive programs. But it's something worth noting, because for parents who maybe were applying to colleges, back when I was, and we thought of public institutions as, safeties for everybody, that's not necessarily true anymore. And you need to be aware of that. There's a big increase in the amount of early action, early decision applications. We'll get into what that means in a few minutes. And when I mentioned the rise of social media, just so you know, kids, you got to be careful. Colleges definitely keep an eye on social media, and you never want something that you posted there to be brought into getting into or not getting into a college. And that's more just kind of fair warning. You guys know that in all circles of life, but college admissions definitely use them. Okay, I'm probably going to spend about as much time on this slide as I will on anything today. So the right fit. You notice this is broken down into factors to consider, factors in admission. So juniors, when you met in your Naviance workshop, you remember we talked about, you think about 4 or 5 questions, okay, that you answered on that advanced college search, which we had you do, to be able to start developing your list. And the questions are pretty simple. Over on the left-hand side, and you notice the ones that I think are the most important ones to start with are in red. 4-year versus a 2-year college. Location, location, location. That is probably one of the biggest questions you have to answer. What geographical area are you going to put your search towards, and why? Well, if you looked in the entire 50-state continental United States, well, including Hawaii and Alaska, there's over 4,000 4-year colleges out there. All right. There's also another couple of thousand 2-year colleges. You can't possibly research all those schools. And there are schools everywhere that will have the major you're looking for, the size, the setting. So we always say to kids, if I asked you the first 2 questions you had to answer, one is, of course, 4-year versus 2 years, very important. What do you want to major in? Now, some of you might not know yet what you want to major in, and that's okay. Plenty of our students who are current seniors are going into college undecided. But if you know what you want to major in, that's definitely a factor that will go into helping you narrow your list. And then after that, location. Now, when we say location, we're not saying you have to narrow it down and say, I'm only looking in Massachusetts. You don't want to do that either. Typically, a lot of our students do look in the New England area, which gives you 6 states. They might include New England in that. Some kids might say, no, I want to stay within a 2 or 3 hour radius. So maybe you limit it to Mass, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and maybe Southern New Hampshire. The idea is you're picking a geographical area, not just one state. Now, some kids, might come in and say, yeah, I'm looking mostly in New England, but I'm curious about some schools down in the mid-Atlantic, like Maryland and Virginia and Carolina, DC, Washington, DC. That's fine too. Just the idea that we're trying to say is, you can't go into the process saying, well, I'll go anywhere in the United States, because there's just not enough time to research all those schools. So you don't have to narrow it down just to one area, but you got to narrow it down somewhat. And that location is very important. Size of the school. Now, if you go on Naviance, they break it down even more than my little size, small, medium, and large that I have written here. They even break it down, I believe, into extra small, small, extra large. They, I think, have 5 or 6 choices. But the idea being is, some of you might not care as much, but many of you will find a better fit maybe at some smaller, medium-sized schools. Maybe others of you will be pushed more or have more of a desire to go to a larger type school. Then there's something called setting, whether it's near a city or in the city, or more outside in the suburbs, or of course, way up in Maine in the country. Setting is very important for some kids. There are some kids who will love the idea of being in a city, and some kids say, I want nothing. I want a smaller, more intimate campus, away from the city. There's something out there for all of you. But if you think about those 4 or 5 questions, and if you remember, guys, those of you who did the Naviance workshop, which is most of you, those were 4 or 5 of the questions that we told you to answer. I think if you remember right, we told you don't want to actually answer too many questions or put in too many factors, because then it shrinks your list too much. On the flip side, you can't only answer, 4-year and what your major is without putting in location, perhaps size or setting, because then it might be very difficult to narrow your search even more than that. So it's a combination or the middle ground of finding, some factors to consider, but not limiting it too much. Consider private versus public. That's an important factor, although right now we tell you to kind of look at both. The competitiveness of the school, and that's where we will absolutely help you as your guidance counselors into whether or not you can get into a certain school or not. The cost is very important, which is something you're going to have to consider. And then also for those of you who might have, some musical desires or art or theater or athletics, those are the special characteristics that you'll need to look to. So those are the factors you use to start narrowing your list. And if you put in that information in Naviance into that advanced college search, it will spit out names of schools that they think match what you're looking for. Now, that just gives you some names of schools. You have to do the research to find out how much you like that school. And again, when you do size and setting, you don't just click one of the boxes. Usually we say click a little range, like maybe, click 2 to 3 of them but don't click all of them. And on the flip side, don't just click one. And you play around with it until it gives you an adequate number of schools. Now, factors in admission. This is very important. So this goes to over on the left where we talk about the competitiveness or the rigor of the school to get into. Part of the right fit is finding schools that meet your academic profile so you have a good chance of getting in. The factors in admission. Those first few at the top, guys, are the most important thing. Your grades over the past 4 years, which then, of course, computes to a rank in GPA. The rigor of courses, notice that's 4th on the list. Those 3 things are all your academic transcript. And you've heard us say this, your academic transcript is usually the number 1 factor into being able to get admitted to a school. Sometimes we might not always like that. We wish maybe some of the other things were highlighted more, and they are highlighted. But it starts with your grades, your academic production, your transcript, which includes all those things. And remember, we said how important rigor of courses are. So when you're choosing your courses for next year, that is important. Standardized test scores, and we'll get into a little more specifically about the SATs in a second, but they are very important, even though a lot of schools are going test optional this year. I'll explain it more in a minute. When we talk about things like recommendations, your resume, your essay, an interview, if you choose to do it. Now, keep in mind, a lot of colleges don't require interviews anymore. And in fact, a lot of them not only don't require them, they don't even give interviews. But if they do, whether it be virtual or in person, I don't know how next year is going to shake out, they can be important. But recommendations, resume, essays, where those things really come into play is if you have schools that are in that match range, and I'll use this as an example. If I applied to a school that was an extreme reach, and I'm using myself personally, and my grades, my GPA, my rank, my standardized tests, weren't even kind of near what they're looking for, then my recommendations, my resume, my essay can only help me so much. On the flip side, if I apply to a school where I'm a definite admit, I'm definitely going to get in based on my grades, my GPA and all that, they might not even have to read my recommendations. But those schools in the middle where you're a good match, but it could go either way, that's where a great resume, a great essay, a good interview, strong recommendations, those are the things that can really help you. Those schools that, you're right there, but you need that extra. And that's where they really come in. So they are very important for those schools. I guess what I'm just saying is they don't necessarily override grades, GPA, and all those other things unless you're close. Special considerations are special considerations, which means if you're, a talented athlete or musician and you're being recruited for other reasons, that's the small number of cases. And when I say small, it's single digits that could actually supersede what I just said about grades and rank and GPA. So there are exceptions to what I just said based on special considerations. And if you're being recruited for a different reason. The college list. So we say the average student applies to 6 to 8 colleges. Now, as I said a little earlier, if we do the average for the class of 2021, I have a feeling that number might come out a little higher for the reasons I said before, mostly because of COVID and some uncertainty with colleges. But in a typical year, the average student applies to 6 to 8. And when we talk about 6 to 8, we talk about because maybe we want to make sure everybody has 1 to 2 in the safety range. Now, what is a safety? A safety is a school that we think, and again, we will help you with this, that you have, let's say, a 95 or higher percent certainty that you're going to get in. Can't say 100%, so we can never say, a definitive statement, but that's what a safety is. The other thing, guys, you got to remember, safety school is also one that you would like to go to. Don't just make a school your safety because, quote, unquote, I can get in. You actually might have to go to that school. So it should also be one that you have a genuine interest in that matches what you're looking for. The safety should not be a throw in by any means. So maybe you have 1 to 2 safeties. Maybe you have 1 to 2 reach schools, schools that we know maybe your GPA is a little below what they're looking for. Your scores are a little below. But you know what? You put your best foot forward. We encourage students to apply to 1 to 2 reach schools because you never know. The idea, though, is you're not doing yourself the best service if you apply to 6 or 7 reach schools. And then the match, those are the schools, that's where you have the majority of your list, maybe 3, 4, 5 schools in that match range, maybe even more, where we know your chances to get in are very good, but it's not the 95% safety and it's not a reach. And that's where a lot of your schools should be. Now, when we say the average student applies to 6 to 8, I thought I can think of a couple of kids this year who only applied to 2 schools because we knew they were both either a safety or match. They had narrowed it down. They knew that's where they wanted to go. They applied early. They got in early. And then they said, well, maybe I won't send in the rest of my applications. On the flip side, I know somebody told me about a student who applied to 20 schools. We don't advise that. That's too much. It's very expensive to apply to this many schools. And remember, at some point, you have to narrow it down to 1. So the less you narrow it down now, eventually you're going to have to do that. But again, the 6 to 8, there's no law on that. I do think this year we had more kids who were closer to that 10 range, and that's okay. And the reasons that some of you might apply to more schools is if you're applying to a very competitive major like nursing or engineering, maybe going back to location where instead of 1 geographical location, like New England, you had 2 different geographical locations. Well, then maybe that means you ended up having to apply to more schools. Could also mean if you're applying to more schools that are very competitive to get into, maybe we added an extra 1 or 2 just to be safe. So that's some of the reasons that somebody might apply to on the higher end. But again, guys, you don't want to go so high on that because of the reasons I just mentioned. But that's how, eventually when we get to fall, and when I say fall, September, October, we're hoping that you narrow down your list to that, which meets 1 to 2 at least in the safety to reach category and definitely more in the match. You might also hear the word fit for a match school, fit, match, something like that. The college visit. Okay, so obviously, you're using Naviance to do some research. You go on each college's website. When I say brochures, I don't know how many of you are still looking at hard copies of brochures, but maybe you are. But the key is looking at the information for the schools. The visit, we always say, is probably the most important part of your college research. Now, having said that, we all know visits are a little tough right now. Some of you might not feel comfortable doing visits, even if colleges are having them. And many colleges have opened up to start doing visits on a limited basis. But in addition, they all have either a virtual campus tour on their website or on Naviance. Some of you have probably already seen right at the top of the Naviance page that it's already posted as a tab right there. But if not, you go to their site. But whether it be now or later, these visits, and the good thing for you guys is that things as they open up, visits will be a little more possible. You want to get out there and visit. If you feel comfortable doing some in-person visits, especially locally, there are definitely some schools doing them over your April vacation. That is a phenomenal time. The weather is better. You can see what the schools look like. When we talk about informal and formal, informal visits are simply, let's say you're in the neighborhood of the school and, campus has an open gate and you guys just to take a drive through and see what the campus is like, see what the surrounding area is like, especially if it's a city school, or even a suburban school to see what the rest of the area looks like. A formal visit is where, you go on the website, you sign up to take a tour at a specific time and location. And the good thing about that is, you get to go inside the buildings. You get to see the housing and the dormitories and the cafeteria. And there's somebody talking to you as they're showing these things to you to tell you what the campus is like and what you can look forward to and so forth. And so, the formal visits are huge in that respect. Also in the fall, in a normal year, you've probably heard me say in a normal year many times, but I'm hoping for the fall that there will be a little more normalcy. Colleges might often also have what's called open houses, which is not just where you can get a tour of the campus, but where you can also speak to people from different academic programs and majors and clubs and find out a lot more about what's going on at that school. So if and when open houses start happening, we highly advise them, again, if you feel comfortable doing them. And if you don't feel comfortable doing the visits, as I said, virtual college visits, almost every website. The good news about 2020 and 21 is colleges, if they didn't have a very good virtual tour set up on their website, they have one now because they've all had to do that. So let me circle back to SATs and ACTs. Most colleges, and I did put out a memo on this on Parent Square, most colleges, almost every college for this past year, for the class of 2021, went test optional. What does test optional mean? Well, test optional means you don't have to submit SAT or ACT scores to apply. Indications are telling us that most colleges will be continuing the test optional policy for you as juniors, class of 2022. Now, what does that mean? Notice I said most because we can't speak for every college, so we need to be careful with that. But let's say for a second, all of your colleges are test optional. That doesn't necessarily mean don't take the SATs. I would say, and I don't have an exact number on this, but plenty of our seniors, maybe even half of them, actually submitted SAT scores because they were able to take them. And if you do well on them, that even though a school is test optional, your scores can certainly help. So the reasons to still take the SAT or ACT at least once, and we've sent out information about how to register and so forth, is especially if you feel confident that you can do well. And let's be honest, even if you don't know, sometimes you never know unless you try it. If you take the SATs and do well, maybe we say you're better off submitting your scores. If you don't, you just toss them away. And if your schools are test optional, which most of them will be, you will not be penalized. So really what test optional means is you're not penalized if you can't take them or you don't do well, but you might benefit if you take them and do well. And so that's why we've advised it for a lot of you. So that's kind of what test optional means. Now, many of you might know this, even pre-COVID, many colleges, especially in this area, were already instituting a test optional policy. And everything I just said was true of them for the last 5 or even 10 years for some colleges. But the idea is that many schools, UMass Amherst, Boston University, they weren't test optional. They are now temporarily because of COVID. 2 other notes to make. The essay portion on the SAT has been eliminated. Technically, it's still available if you register in May and June, but we're advising you guys, colleges are not looking at it, especially for next year. So we're advising you not to take it and to focus on the other 2 sections, which are more important. And for any of you who are wondering, SAT subject tests have been eliminated as of right now. You can't even take one if you'd like to. Subject tests usually in our graduating classes, maybe only about 5 to 7% of students would even have needed them in the application process. But even if that was the case, they've been eliminated moving forward. And I'm just throwing this slide out there again. This was in the memo that I put out on Parent Square, upcoming SAT and ACT dates. Just please note, the first 4 bullets, the 2 SATs and 2 ACTs, if you want to register for those dates, and you see the deadlines right there, you register through the College Board for the SAT or actstudent.org for the ACT. In other words, you create a site, you create your own account on those websites. For those of you who took the PSAT, you have one probably for College Board, and you register there. The only exception to that is the Braintree High School SAT School Day on April 13th, which if you want to take that one, you register internally. That's the links that I sent out. So that you all have it. It's still up there on Parent Square. That's the only exception to that. And that's the difference with a school day SAT is that they let us do the registrations in-house and you do the payments through us as well. This comes under information we think you should know. It goes back to what I said before about the the state schools and universities. This chart, if you notice at the top, the state universities encompasses, UMass, the 4 UMass campuses, and the state universities on the second bottom half of this page is Bridgewater State, Fitchburg State, Framingham State, Worcester State, etc. What this tells you, and this has been true for a while, this goes back to when I was saying how much more competitive they are, is they are looking for admission for a minimum 3.0 GPA, minimum. However, that doesn't mean you can't get admitted if you don't have a 3.0. We have plenty of students who have got admitted without a 3.0. They have, if you do not have a 3.0, they have what's called a sliding scale. Now, I'm not quite sure how these universities are going to handle it with the test optional for next year, but this is another reason why it's worth taking the SATs at least once. What this tells you is if you look at the chart, I'm not going to read this whole chart to you, But if you look at the top for UMass, okay, if you don't have a 3.0, what they're saying is if you have a 2.51 to 2.99, if you're in that range, they're looking for a 1030 SAT or a 20 on the ACT. Down below, for the state universities like Bridgewater, they're looking for a 990 if your GPA is in that range, or a 19 on the ACT. Now, let me be clear. This is the minimum standards to get admitted. This qualifies you. It doesn't mean you do get admitted. UMass Amherst, I can tell you right now, these minimum standards, there's not a lot of students getting admitted to UMass Amherst with this minimum standard now. So again, it means you qualify, but it doesn't mean you get admitted. In some of the schools, like I said, UMass Amherst are definitely more competitive. UMass Lowell has become more competitive. They all have, but those Amherst is certainly the most competitive of the state universities as far as admission now. Okay, a couple of things on college applications options. I mentioned them early. Early action and early decision. Early action is when you apply early. I'm going to give you typical dates around this in the Northeast. The earliest early action is usually November 1st. Different parts of the country, this might be a little different, and you always have to check your dates, but I'm just giving you some general ideas. You apply early, November 1st. You find out if you got admitted early, usually before, let's say, Christmas or 6 to 8 weeks after the application. But you don't have to commit to going there until that May 1st deadline that we talked about before, and you can still apply to other schools. I would say most years, a good 35 to 40%. It's actually gone up, even probably closer to 45% of our seniors, because you'll be a senior, applies early action. Early decision is much different and a little more of a serious commitment. Early decision is the same of what I just said, in that you apply early, maybe November 1st, maybe November 15th. You find out early, maybe by Christmas. But if you get in, you've agreed, because you've signed off on a binding contract, that if you get in, you're going to this college, you're canceling all your other applications, and that's it, you're done. That is a very serious commitment. That is a family decision. You would have it with your counselor. I would say every year we only have, 10 to maybe 12 seniors who do an early decision school. And that's because very early in the process, you've identified that school, you know that's where you want to go. And this is very important. You also know you can afford to go there. Because if you apply to one school early decision and get admitted, and now you have to cancel your other applications, you'll never find out what other schools may have offered you in terms of money. So early decision is you can hear why I'm saying not a lot of our kids do it, because you have to make that decision very early in the process, and you have to know that you can afford them. Again, we'll talk very specifically to those of you who think this might be for you. Now, by the way, early action and early decision is not necessarily your choice. Each college either has that option to apply or doesn't. Some just have what you see below, regular admission or rolling admission. So early decision, in fact, a lot of colleges don't even have that. A lot more having early action, but the idea is when you look up your schools, you can see if they have early action, if they have early decision. Regular admission is pretty simple. Let's say a school just has regular decision, or you apply regular decision, and that a common deadline date might be January 1st or January 15th. Doesn't matter how much before that decision deadline you get in your application, you'll all find out at the same time, more or less, when you get in. So you apply regular, you find out later in the spring. Rolling is somewhat similar to regular, but the difference is that colleges, they keep assessing applications on a rolling basis as they get them. So if you apply rolling, you might find out within six weeks whether you get in or not. So they might have a rolling admission process where you can apply all the way up to March 1st, but you don't have to wait with everybody else to find out if you got in. Rolling, if you apply, let's say, in November, you might find out within 4 to 6 weeks whether you got in. And that's actually kind of a cool little advantage, because now you don't need a safety anymore if you got into a school, either early action or rolling. But again, these admission decisions are different for each school. You're going to hear us talk about deadline dates. It's your job to make sure you know when your deadline dates are, depending on which of these schools you're applying to, which cycle you're applying to, and what they have. Never miss a deadline. You can't do anything about it if you miss a deadline. And you need to keep track of all that. And Naviance is a great tool to do that. And just let me back up 1 second. When I do talk about early action, I mentioned November 1st, but there are plenty of early action schools that their deadline might be November 15th or even December 1st. But you get the idea. It's early enough in the fall. And by the way, you might have the options. Let's say I'm applying to 8 colleges. Well, maybe 3 of them I'm applying early action because I think I'm a good candidate to apply early action. I have my applications done. But the other ones, maybe I'm applying regular or rolling a little later in the process. The other thing with early decision, I should have mentioned, you can apply to multiple early action schools. You cannot apply to more than one early decision school. Now, college application types and components on the left, the common application is probably the most common one that many of you would use. I'm going to say, I don't know, out of kids who applied to 4-year colleges, most of you as seniors next year, 70% of you, 75% of you will probably use the common application where on that one website, assuming the school subscribes to it, because not every school does, same as early action, early decision, the school has to, have that as an option for you. But if they do, common application, you create one account and maybe you can apply to 6, 7, 8, 9 schools all through the common application. If they don't use the common application, you're going to that school's college website and finding their online app and creating an account on your own. I know some students this year who applied to 8 schools all in the common app. I know some that had common app for 6 of them, but then there was 2 of them where they had to go specifically to that website. And by the way, paper has very few colleges. I don't know if I personally worked with any student who had to fill out a paper application this year. Now, over on the right, your application may include, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is where in the fall we'll put out plenty more either help videos or hopefully have an in-person workshop or session where we go over this. But I just want to at least mention it to you now because, again, applications don't go out until the fall. We have plenty of time. We really want you to focus on the research of colleges and developing your list. But in a nutshell, your application is going to include the application form, which is most likely an application online. It's going to include your high school transcript, and along that is what we call a school profile, which tells them how to read the transcript and what we offer here at Braintree High School. Your standardized test scores, SAT or ACT, if you choose to submit them. Recommendations, 1 to 2 recommendations, very few schools. Some schools might require a third, in which case you may have to ask a second teacher, but have that conversation with your counselor if you see that as a requirement. Your activity list or resume, your personal essay, of course. Now, personal essay, going back to the common application, some schools have what's called supplementary essays. So many of you might only have to write one personal essay, and if you're on the common app, that's it. Some of you, for a couple of colleges, might have to write a second essay, or even if it's not a full-length essay, short answer questions, short answer or paragraph, give or take. But personal essay or essays are definitely part of it. Interview, as I mentioned before, is optional, but that might be something that you submit. And when I say other, this could be, if you're applying to an art school, you might have to submit a portfolio, and that's kind of a big other. If you're a theater student or a music student and you're applying to a program like that, you might have to audition or send them an audition tape. So other, I would say maybe only like 5 or 10% of you need to do something like that. If you're an athlete, you're being recruited. There's, the NCAA clearinghouse, but for the most part, it's those things up at the top, the application form. And I guess one thing that should be listed here, we'll get in the fall, as part of your application form and submitting is paying for it. There is an application fee. I probably should have listed that there, but that all comes under the application. So again, we will get more into this in the fall. You don't need to focus on this. Between now and fall, the 2 things that you can work on are definitely your resume and your essay. But you're not submitting them, so we'll get to that when the time comes. Now, Naviance. Juniors, you've seen this, so this is more for your parents. Folks, we use Naviance extensively with students. We showed them how to use it. They should all have an account now. If they don't, contact your guidance counselor. But Naviance is a college and career search platform where you can research majors, careers, fields to find out what you're interested in, but then also colleges. And let me just mention this. Some students will say to us, I have a college list, but it's not on Naviance. Let me just mention, not only do we think Naviance is a great program for this, but just so you know, when we get to the fall, certain documents, your teacher letter recommendation, your transcripts, there are things that actually get submitted to colleges and linked up through Naviance. So Whether your college list is on Naviance now or not, you probably should get it there, because in the fall, your applications can't be complete if you don't have them on your application list. Now, if you notice on this page, and this is welcome Adam as a fictional student we made up, colleges I'm thinking about, colleges I'm applying to. Right now, you should be developing your list under colleges I'm thinking about, right? Because you don't know exactly where you're applying to. In the fall, we'll show you how to shift them there and the things that you have to do so that we can send all your documents. I'm not going to go through Naviance too much at length because, again, we shared them with the students. And by the way, under this welcome message on the left, and I'm sorry, it's a little cut off, right underneath this little blurb, under that welcome message for juniors, is the link to that guidance Google site that I told you we created, where we will post documents that can be beneficial. So students, that's how you can find the guidance site. So one thing that we showed you how to do, and if I go back a page, if I go to that top tab, see where it says colleges, and underneath that is find your research colleges or find your fit. It leads you to the advanced college search. We showed you this, guys, just to come full circle. Not only did we show juniors this at our meeting, but if you remember earlier in this presentation, when I talked about the questions you answer, type of school, 4-year versus 2-year, location, we talked extensively about that. Students, which is where you will find the question on size of the school or setting of the school. Majors, if you notice where it says majors, to put in the major you're looking for. In admission, there's a question where you can answer the competitiveness of the school, the range. The other things, special programs, cost, and athletics. If you remember in that previous slide, I told you some of you might not need to be aware of those. But this is where you answer those 4 or 5 general questions, and don't just do the search once. Play around with it. See what other times come out if you answer a couple of questions slightly different. This advanced college search will definitely get you that general college list. Parents, just so you know, what we told juniors to do, we showed them how to use this, is we want them to start developing their list so that when we meet with them, we can help them. We can say, hey, you might need a safety school or 2 on this list, or no, your list is great as it is, or hey, I see that you're interested in these 2 schools. Here's another school I know of that you might also like based on what you're telling me. So we want students to play around with this list. Remember, you can't make any mistakes right now. You're just developing a tentative list, or as Naviance says, colleges I'm thinking about. You're not doing any applications yet anyway, so there's no harm done. Just add them to your list. But this search engine, again, we showed you how to do it. If you have any questions, see your counselor, but it's a great search tool to help you develop your list. And then, for this fictional student, we added the schools to the colleges I'm thinking about list. And students, if you remember this, and parents, the easiest way, if I looked up a student, if I looked at Assumption College, and if I was on a student account, there would be a heart next to it. And if I just click that heart and it turns red, that's how I add them to my list. In the spring, in the fall, we will talk to you about how to move them to your application list and the other things you need to do to make sure you request your transcript correctly and all that stuff. This page right here, and I'm sorry, it's a little cut off at the top, but this is what's called the Scattergram. So under each college on Naviance, there is a profile page where it has plenty of information on that college. And at the top of that profile is the link right to the college's website. So we always say, do some research on Naviance first. Find out as much as you can on Naviance, and then follow the link to, let's say, Assumption College's website so you can do even more there. Like I said, the virtual tour, finding out if they have my major, any other information that might be beneficial. However, on the Naviance page under academics, if you scroll down, this is the Scattergram page. This data is specific to Braintree High School students who have applied over the last 3 years and have either gotten into that school, with the green check mark tells you they got in, or an X tells you they got denied. If I'm looking at this student, if you follow me, the student who got in, you can see where the GPA line is. The GPA is over on the left, and just under 3.5 is what the average GPA is for whatever school this is for a kid who applied. And if you notice on the bottom, it has the SAT scores. The average GPA is in between the 1200 and 1400. It's probably about 1240. That tells me that it's the average. Now, what does that mean? Does it say, well, if I don't have that average GPA, I shouldn't apply there? No, not at all. If you're somewhat in the ballpark, that's where those other things can help you get over the top. But if you notice the people who have the X's here, this student who applied, probably had about a 2.3 GPA, the one I'm looking at, and 800 SATs. They just weren't close enough to those averages. But if you notice, there are plenty of students with green check marks that are below the average, but they were in that ballpark. And that's where those other things probably helped pull them over the top. On the flip side, if you notice people who were well above the average, they all got in. So now the scattergram is not the end all be all. And I will tell you this, if you're looking at colleges that are a little further outside of New England, and we don't tend to send a lot of applications, you might not see a lot of X's or checks. And by the way, sometimes you might see a symbol for getting deferred. That's another option, or waitlisted. But the green check and the red X is the one you'll see the most. If you looked at UMass Amherst, if I used UMass Amherst as an example, the scattergram would be full of check marks. It might even be almost too much to look at because we send so many applications there. But that data is very valuable. If I go on to any school's website, if I went on to UMass Amherst website, on Amherst website, it will tell me what the average GPA is for students admitted, their average SAT scores. But what Naviance is doing here is it's not only telling you what the average is, it's telling you what the average was from Braintree High School students. And why that's important and why that number or those numbers might be a little different is because maybe our GPAs have better value at that school, or maybe not, but we tend to find that it has better value. So maybe on the website, it says that a school's looking for a 3.5, and then you go on Scattergram and you say, wait a minute, Braintree High kids are getting in at an average of 3.3. That's great. But again, you're a Braintree High School student. Your transcript is a Braintree High School transcript. How it weighs on that school is going to be very comparable to what you see on Naviance. Again, this is very useful for colleges that we send a lot of applications to. If I pick the University of North Carolina, where maybe we only send 1 to 2 applications per year, the data might still be valuable, don't get me wrong, but you might have to depend on their overall national averages that they do have their website. Whereas the schools we have more locally, you can use this. One quick thing on financial aid, because a couple things, because I did mention that we will have a separate financial aid program. And this past year, we did do it virtually. So either way, we will have a financial aid night for parents with more details. But just a couple of quick notes. Number one, the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. That's the most important document you have to submit. It is not even available. If you went on FAFSA right now and started filling it out as a junior or as a junior parent, you'd be filling out the wrong one and you'd be doing it for nothing. The FAFSA for the class of 2022 doesn't come out until October 1st of 2021. So you don't need to fill out a FAFSA right now. And in fact, you can't. But the things we'll cover at the evening program next year is, the cost of attendance and net price, who qualifies for financial aid, how and when you should apply, and need versus merit based. But I just wanted to mention that first bullet point because I don't want you to think you're missing anything. You could go on. Each college website has is required to have a cost analysis link that you can fill out and put in some numbers so they can give you an idea on what your financial aid might look like. But again, other than that, you can't fill out the FAFSA until the fall. The other thing I will say is if you don't remember anything that's said about financial aid now or in the fall is deadlines. The deadlines are key. You cannot miss deadlines if you expect to get financial aid. But again, more on that in the fall because that goes with the timeline. We have other things to worry about right now. So just to kind of sum up what you should do now or over the summer, and this goes back to the timeline from earlier. Hopefully, a lot of you have registered or will register if you choose for at least one SAT or ACT, though the SAT is the one that's more prevalent right now, I would say. You've registered for at least once. You're beginning to make that college list on Naviance based on all this information that we've said and what we covered during the Naviance workshop. You start researching colleges. And again, when we say research, that includes visits. Start now. You feel comfortable going in person, and if your college is allowing, great. If you don't, do as many virtual campus tours as you can. Maintaining strong grades, juniors, none of this will mean anything if you don't maintain strong grades. And meeting with your counselor. Again, right now, many of you are doing that to talk programming, but you're also probably talking colleges. You'll have another or maybe another time to meet specifically about colleges as well. Those are the main things that you want to be working on now. Later in the spring and over the summer, keeping those college visits and research going, maybe later in the summer, you're starting to narrow that list. So right now, maybe I've got, 15 or 18 schools are on my list. But remember, I said we're trying to target to narrow it by the fall to eventually that average of 6 to 8, or give or take, that I'm applying to. So maybe over the summer, you've started narrowing it. The college essay. Now, I could have put this in either category because I do think later this spring, many of you in your English classes will work on your college essay. But whether you do it in the spring or not, you really want to come back to school in the fall with at least a draft of one or even two essays. So you have, your leg up on that. Resume, we showed you how you can do that on Naviance. It's a very simple template. Naviance is very user friendly. And even if we didn't show you, I guarantee most of you could probably already figure it out over the summer. Make sure you come back with a draft of your resume and ask for teacher rec. That's probably before we go in the summer. We'll give you guys a heads up on that, but probably in June, late May and June, we'll tell you to, at least verbally or by email, ask a teacher for one rec, and we'll give you more direction on that. That is it for now. That's a pretty lengthy presentation. I'm hoping you all, paid attention to as much as you have, as much as you could. And as always, reach out if you have any questions. There will be more to cover, but this should give you a good way to start off the process. Thank you very much.